Good evening, everyone, and welcome to episode 46 of SCOTONOMICS. I know your week in the UK started with a momentous occasion. My week in Barcelona, our local festival, finished yesterday, so we had a Thursday, Friday, Saturday and Sunday of late nights, a lot of partying and a lot of music. So I know that's very different from most of our viewers who are watching from the UK. Welcome to our viewers on Facebook, LinkedIn and Twitter, and it's great, especially to have you live with us tonight. The first thing I'd like to do, as always, is to welcome my co-host, Kieran Van Sweden. Hi, Kieran. How are you doing?
I'm good, yes, and I've had the day off essentially because we've had the Queen's funeral here in the UK, which has it's been on the television for a long time. So yeah, it's been quite a different day for most of us, I think, in the UK. Yeah, some quite interesting things going on politically as well. Apparently, Liz Truss was snubbed by Biden. Apparently, that's a really bad thing, and diplomatically. And then the other thing is the announcement coming from Kwasi Kwarteng about these low tax towns coming on Friday. So that's quite interesting. We're going to need to keep an eye on that.
There's still things going on. In our interview with Stuart McIntosh last week, we asked about Liz Truss and if it would be any change in the relationship with the UK, and he suggested that she was no more popular than Boris Johnson was with Biden. So that seems like it's been followed through. And yeah, I think it'd be really good for us to look at these kind of tax towns next week. We can maybe have a little bit of reading and look into that. But tonight, we're going to speak to Will, and I don't think there's any plans for these tax towns in Wales. I think it's just England. I'm not sure if they're going to be in Scotland as well, but it'll be really interesting to look at. And I suppose that's a good place to start with, how we're doing differently already in Scotland and Wales from England. But here we have Will, and he's going to join us now.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Hi, well, no, very pleased to have you, and we'll put you up there in prime. In prime position. Well, we're going to speak a little bit about your book, and I'm sure we're going to get lots of questions from the audience around Wales, the Welsh economy, some politics, maybe even some sport. Who knows where we'll get to. Please do, any questions you drop in the comments, I'll ask Will. We've got a series of questions that we'll ask him, but we'll prioritise yours. So please do drop in those questions into any of the comment panels that you've got. If you can start it with a Q and then the question, then I can find it a little bit easier. But I know we've got a first one for Kieran to get us going.
Hi, Will. So welcome to SCOTONOMICS. It's great to have you. We really need to get a little bit about yourself for our audience. So can you tell us a wee bit about yourself, and then also tell us why you decided to write this book?
Sure. So my name is Will Haywood. I'm originally from England. This actually does sound like the start of Blind Date, doesn't it, actually? No, I hear it out loud. So I moved to Cardiff in 2008 for university, and like a lot of people in Cardiff, just never left. So I started working as a journalist at Wales Online and the Western Mail. Wales Online is the largest news website in Wales. In 2016, just as the Brexit vote happened. And I've been working there since then. I work primarily doing our politics and investigations pieces. And in 2020, I wrote my first book on COVID-19 in Wales and how it played out, because I was in both the Welsh government lobby and in the UK government lobby. So I had quite a unique, because unlike with Scotland, there isn't as broad a political lobby journalistically for Wales as there is in Scotland. And then I've just finished, I've just had my second book published, Independent Nation, which looks at whether the practicalities of Wales becoming an independent country. So, and you flashed it up there. Fantastic. Thank you very much. That might double my sales. So the reason I decided to write this book. So the pandemic and also Brexit really awoke, especially the pandemic, awoke like a devolved consciousness in Wales. So although we've had, we had in the last Senedd election, the first time that people who've grown up exclusively under devolution have been able to vote in Wales, it was really the first recognition among many parts of Welsh society that Wales can actually do something differently. Although the Welsh government has been running their schools, hospitals for several decades, this was the first time that anyone seemed to really know what was happening in Cardiff Bay. Mark Drakeford went from this guy who could easily have walked down any high street in Wales and no one would have known him, probably 1 in 20, 1 in 30 maybe, to being one of the most recognisable faces. So for the first time, the debate about whether Wales could be independent was being had in a meaningful way beyond a few people with beards in pubs in Carmarthenshire. So it's the first time we were really looking at it properly. And I felt that if we're going to have this debate, we need to have it from the most informed position possible. So the book itself isn't an advocate for independence. It doesn't necessarily speak against independence. It's a toolkit for forming your own opinion. So the challenge with that was, obviously in Scotland, you have a well-developed independent side and a well-established unionist side. In Wales, we don't have that. We have a very small but passionate independent side, many of which have really only looked at independence through memes. And then there isn't really an opposition side. There is just everyone else really who hasn't engaged with it. So that was the idea of the book.
So support for Welsh independence currently sits at about 30%. And, you know, from the research in the book, do you think that that percentage could grow?
Yeah, I think it could grow. I think Scotland was on 30%, I think, only a year or two before 2014. So we know how quickly these things can change. But I think the bigger difference, the thing in Wales, it's not necessarily that the percentage, they need to focus on growing that percentage. They need to focus on growing the salience, because there's a lot of people who will go, that sounds like good. And they'll say, yeah, I support that. But it doesn't move them. It doesn't stir them. They haven't necessarily seen the connection that the independent side need to make between independence and solving these problems that they're facing every day. And Wales has got a lot of problems that it needs to tackle. I mean, most people say they support House of Lords reform, but that doesn't mean the Lib Dems sweep to a massive majority, does it? So I think it's improving that salience, which is going to be the main target of the independence movement going forward.
Great. We've got a question from the audience already, from Hashbury, who's one of our regular viewers. Could you run through the reserved powers in Wales at the moment, and which would be most advantageous transferred to the Senate?
I think justice would be a really important one. I also think rail. So this is a really good example. So with the book, I don't tell anyone what to think, but we do start with the assumption, and I think it's a fair assumption, that the current system doesn't work for Wales. I don't think it works for Scotland. I don't think it works for England either, for that matter. But we do start from that assumption. So let's take rail as an example. So rail isn't devolved. Rail spending isn't devolved, whereas it is in Scotland, it is in Northern Ireland.
To take that wider, is that transport? Is transport not reserved, or is it just rail services within transport?
It's actually, rail services actually do have a devolved element, but it's rail infrastructure that it isn't devolved. So it was offered to Wales in 2007, 2008 by Tony Blair's administration, but the Welsh government at the time rejected it because they didn't think that they'd have the capital to essentially manage the liabilities they'd be taking on. Now, looking back, this is actually a massive, massive mistake on their part, because let's take HS2. So HS2, the UK government has defined that as an England and Wales project, despite the fact not a single centimetre of track is actually going to be within Wales. So by doing that, that means that there is no automatic Barnet consequential. There could be. So when they built Crossrail, they actually defined that as an England-only service development. So Wales did get a Barnet consequential, but it's not getting one automatically because it isn't devolved. So,
and I think Scotland does. I think we get a Barnet consequential. So it's really peculiar that Wales is in that situation with HS2.
Well, it's an economic sleight of hand to save £5 billion. So the argument is people from North Wales will be able to get to London slightly quicker. That is the proposed advantage of it. Obviously, it's a north-south line. There's a strong argument to say it actually benefits Scotland far more than it does England, if you look at it from that point of Wales, if you look at it from that point of view. It also is going to cost the South Wales economy 200 million a year because it takes so much capacity off of that line. But putting that aside, it will, if you were to take that £5 billion, you could build this the Swansea Bay Metro. You could build the Cardiff Bay, the Cardiff area and Valley Line metros. You could also connect Aberystwyth on the west coast with Cardiff, because at the moment, if you want to go from Aberystwyth to Cardiff, you have to go via Shrewsbury in England. It's mad. All of that stuff could be easily done for that £5 billion, but instead, people in North Wales are able to get to London slightly faster. That's the offset. So I would say that the biggest, in a way that would make a meaningful difference very, very quickly, it would be the devolution of all rail, which would make much more sense. But the Welsh government would also like justice to be devolved.
Yeah. Okay, and what's the rationale for the justice piece?
The rationale for justice. So say you're a youth worker you're working in the valleys. All the things that you have to interact with, all those services that you use to help young people, will come from will be devolved. So housing is devolved, local government is devolved, education devolved, health devolved, but the criminal justice system in which they have to interact is not devolved. So actually, there can be a real disconnect between actually trying to solve these very deep-rooted problems when the aims of the key components of that aren't aligned. So they would argue that actually that would be a very easy thing for them to, well, not easy is probably the wrong word, but that would be a useful thing to be devolved.
Great. Kieran, I'll jump in with another question after you've done your run.
So the impression from your research is that a lot of people think that Welsh independence, the people that you spoke to, Welsh independence is a means of fixing societal problems rather than flag waving and a sense of nationalism. I noticed from your article in The Guardian that you state that around a third of Welsh children live in poverty. I know that the figure in Scotland is between 1 in 4, 1 in 5, so it's slightly less here in Scotland, but I was really shocked at that figure actually. So that's bound to be a big driver for people thinking about independence.
Yeah, there's 600,000 roughly children in Wales, and 200,000 of them live in poverty. I think of them, 60,000 live in severe poverty. Those numbers are just off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure they're right. When I started the research, I assumed that the primary driver for most of the independence movement would be the arguments of the gut, arguments of the soul. Like this is, I mean, Wales is it's probably a really interesting thing to get into if you wanted to. Like the feeling of Welshness is very different to the feeling of Scottishness. Like Scottish nationalism has always taken the form of state building. Like there's never been an insecurity in Scotland of Scotland as a nation. That hasn't always ever been a thing that you felt you needed to preserve. In Wales, there's been much more focus on nation building as opposed to state building. But I thought that would be the primary driver for most people who supported independence. Actually, especially people who've come to it since 2016, they've taken a look at the myriad of problems that Wales faces. And they've said that actually they think that the easiest way to solve these problems is through independence. And I think that does, as I say, I'm not an advocate for or against independence, but I think that speaks to what they see as the intransigence of the current system we have, in that they think that independence, and Welsh independence that matter, is the simplest way of solving these problems. So that is the primary motivation of the vast majority of people I've heard. There's obviously identity elements within that as well, but most of it, there's a lot of utility in their decision. This is, I think, the best way of solving a problem.
Well, that's really interesting. I'm not sure if that recent research has been done in Scotland, but certainly that's my feeling as well. You know, I think there's a very small element of the Scottish independence movement which is nationalist based. It's much more about the ability to solve the problems that we have. And one of our comments here, you know, I think this has devolution shown us that really our parliaments can just mitigate bad Westminster policy. And I think that's what a lot of people feel when they're looking at the central government in England, and that they have in Wales and in Scotland politicians who are trying to mitigate these policies. So it's interesting to see that seems to be a perspective there from Wales as well. I've got another question here. Well, someone said, where can we get the book? So I'll make sure that I leave a link to that in the comments as soon as we finish. But you can, this is the title of it here. If you just search that on Google, it'll pop straight up. I know I saw a link for Amazon, which I think we have on the website already, but I know it is available from other good bookshops. So back to the question we've got there. How many universities are there in Wales, and do they specialise in any kind of area, R&D, medicine, etc.? And I'd quite like to finish that question with saying to Kieran, I know you always like to say what Scotland's really good at and what it's known for. So I think that'd be quite an interesting perspective from you after we've had that answer from Will.
Off the top of my head, I can't name you every single university that Wales has. They've been increasing. I mean, Wales has, just take Cardiff. Cardiff actually is a real centre for learning. Like we've got 3 universities here in Cardiff, but there's also Aberystwyth, Bangor, Swansea, really respected institutions. A lot of Wales as a percentage of its economy is actually, especially compared to England, I'm not sure off the top of my head, Scotland, but is disproportionately manufacturing. So you can actually see this just from its carbon emissions. So Wales accounts for 5% of the population, but 20% of UK carbon emissions from industry. That's just from industry. Now, some of that's because we have some enormous steelworks, which are incredibly dirty, and we've actually still got some mines open, which is fairly unbelievable to say that in 2022. But in terms of so in the book we talk about what Wales's niche would be, because obviously if the smaller you are, the more you're going to have to import, and therefore the more you're going to have to export, and it's kind of finding Wales's niche. Now, my job in the book wasn't to really do the independence job for them, but what I did hypothesize about was potential industries you could develop in Wales. So Wales is amazingly well placed to produce tidal power. The Severn Estuary is the second largest tidal range in the world. You've got the potential to really to create a huge amount of energy. I think it's 10% of the UK's electricity could be produced by simply having a barrage in the Severn Estuary, although you wouldn't actually have it in the estuary. We can come to that later. And then in North Wales near Colwyn Bay. And that's quite good because they have different high and low tides, the north and south of Wales. So you wouldn't have huge peaks and troughs. So it'd actually be a really good idea. In terms of that actually sustaining an independent Wales economically, I know I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here. There's quite strong evidence actually you can't make up Wales's fiscal deficit on the back of selling energy. You can sell energy, but it's not going to really touch that huge deficit that Wales has got. But that doesn't mean that it's not something worthwhile doing, not just from a carbon neutral point of view, but also the whole world is now going to be looking for cheaper ways to produce green energy. And if Wales is the place where where all the tidal power expertise are, where they've built barrages, we've built small bays where they can produce a small amount of energy for a small area. If they can overcome the issues around fish migration, which is a huge thing with those large turbines, there are potential ways around it, which I mean, I can't believe I spent so much of my last year talking about turbines in barrages. But I think Wales it's got huge, in answer to the question, it's got huge technological potential, but it has huge areas of deprivation which have not necessarily got the highest standards of education. And but there's potential there, especially using the Wales coastline. But ultimately, Wales has had an economy based on exporting resources and energy before, and it led to mass unemployment and 500,000 people leaving Wales. The real assets in Wales are the people, and that's what they really need to develop. But yes, we've got quite a strong university base. It's been threatened somewhat by Brexit because there was huge amounts of overseas students, but that they're still there and they're still doing well. Like Cardiff's a member of the Russell Group. It's quite a prestigious university, but I would say that because I went there.
Yeah, but Aberystwyth is also a very well thought of university as well.
Absolutely.
Coming on to that concept of a deficit, this is something that we fight quite a lot in the independence movement in Scotland, that Scotland somehow is this economic basket case, and we're running this huge deficit, when in fact you can't run a deficit if you're not a currency issuer. And Scotland and Wales are not currency issuers, so we're not running deficits. And a lot of people don't understand that the deficit really is just the savings in people's bank accounts and just the money that's flowing in the economy and hasn't been taxed back by the currency issuer, which currently is the UK government. Do you think that people understand in the independence movement in Wales that they won't be independent unless they set up their own central bank and their own currency?
Yeah, I mean, there's every realistic person I've spoken to about independence in Wales accepts that you ultimately need your own currency. The issue, interestingly, pound in Welsh is punt, so you really would be taking a punt. So it's actually could be quite a nice thing. But I think the real question is whether you float or peg that currency, and it's how soon you make that transition. But I don't think there's many people who are credibly arguing that you could have an independent Wales without control over monetary levers, because then your only solution to closing that fiscal deficit, or at least narrowing it, is through fiscal policy alone, which I don't think anyone's going to vote for Welsh independence on the promise of severe austerity. I don't think that's a sell. So yeah, I think there's an acknowledgement over the elements of the independence movement that have looked at it that yes, you are going to need your own currency.
Good. Good.
Well, here's another perspective from the audience here. A comment from Ireland, and again, I think that comes back to what you've said at the start, and certainly for Rosalind there. This is what we feel in Scotland, and it's actually the same on both sides. Is that what we've got just now is not meeting the best interests of Scotland, and the unionist side are starting to argue that devolution hasn't worked, and we need to do something differently. And those arguments are, as Will said at the start, are similar to this. So I think there is a growing awareness that something needs to change. It's just what direction we take that change.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, sorry, Carol. Sorry.
No, please. I
was going to say the Welsh, in the same way that the Scottish independence movement really likes Denmark, where Welsh independent loves Ireland. The Welsh independent, they're obsessed with being Ireland. We could be Ireland.
We love the Irish as well, to be honest. So I'm great to have Rosalind on, but we've got another one there. You know, this is something very common on screen. I've just pulled up another one of our comments that Ireland was told it was too small and too stupid to survive without the benevolence of England. We'll kind of comment. We can come back to that second point, but that is a consistent theme across any country who moved itself out of the control of first Great Britain and now the nation states of the United Kingdom. That's definitely the consistency there, and always in the end they're proved wrong, because small nations are successful nations. You know, so that's where we are. Thanks again for that comment.
Do you think also as well that people in the independence movement, it's also the concept of subsidiarity, that, you know, fundamentally we have a very dysfunctional setup in the UK where there's so much power concentrated in London and the southeast that there's no sensitivity to the needs of really anywhere outside of that area. It's not just Wales and Scotland. I mean, we saw during the pandemic the mayor of Manchester get up and say, you know, you need to step up Westminster. So it seems to be that there's just this complete lack of sensitivity about what's required around the whole of the UK from the Westminster government.
Yeah, I mean, I'm from the Midlands originally, so I was born in West Bromwich, lived in Coventry, Northampton. I basically have a penchant for like formerly deprived industrial towns, which is why I moved to Wales, I think. As I say, I'm not actually, I'm not standing up and saying I think independence is the best thing for Wales. I'm not saying either that. I do portray in the book that actually it's not a binary choice, and you explore how you could reform the UK. And I use the example of Quebec. I mean, Quebec came incredibly close to leaving Canada, and then now actually, if you went there, you'd be polling at about 30%, even though it was within a few thousand votes. The way that they made that change was through actually listening and accepting Quebec culture and allowing French and addressing concerns. You don't do that by putting Canadian flags on everything. But I do think there are issues with the Canada example. Quebec is a massive part, a fairly substantial part of Canada, whereas Wales, in particular, obviously Scotland, population-wise is small compared to England, but Wales, you couldn't have a reformed UK where England is one amorphous block. But I mean, at the moment, it's just crazy, isn't it? You've got essentially the the First Minister of England is also the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. It's the same as the Governor of California also been president. It just doesn't work. There's always going to be. I'm not saying that I don't think it could work to be reformed, but if you're an advocate for Welsh independence and if you want to see change in Wales and you think reform is the best way to do it, you've got a choice. You could either lobby for Welsh independence or you could lobby for a reformed UK. But what I would say is if you're in Wales, you only need to, if you want Welsh independence, you only have to convince most people in Wales. Whereas if you want a reformed UK, you need to convince people in the UK as a whole. So I understand why they take that route. I just think I think the realities of independence in terms of border issues is very different for Wales and Scotland. There's a whole chapter of the book which looks at how Do I think federalism would be popular in England? I think it depends where in England you are. And
I think that's a loaded question, Will, to be honest, because, we often hear from the kind of progressive left that, Scotland should really consider trying to reform the United Kingdom. And the key question is that, well, as you said, England's 90% of the UK. So federal state with England involved as a federal state would just be of interest and use to nobody. But would England move towards more a smaller part of that state, as you said? And that's where the difficulty lies, I think.
It is, but I suppose London hasn't voted for a Conservative government for a very long time. Like, it isn't that England is this amorphous block. There's if you can create join the dots to people in the northeast. They actually voted down having a regional mayor or having a kind of a regional assembly. We do think of the UK as a very static thing. But if you look at the last 20 years, it's been in a fairly large state of flux in terms of how it works. I'd argue it's fairly unfinished where we are, but it is capable of reform, but it just doesn't seem to be capable of reform in a way that actually thinks about the implications on other parts of the United Kingdom. Devolution was based upon the fact there would be the same party in Holyrood, Cardiff Bay and Westminster. And once that doesn't happen, it becomes the fault lines are much more stark. So I think it is possible that you could reform it. And I also think independence could work. I just think it's what you think is best for you, and that will depend upon your outlook on risk, your feelings of identity, your own personal income, whereabouts, especially in Wales you live. I think that'll make a much bigger difference to where you live in Scotland, actually, because they're not the same arguments. They're not the same debates, really, Wales and Scotland.
But what I would like to concentrate on before we kind of finish on this, because you've raised it there, is this kind of the economics of independence, which I would definitely like to cover tonight. And if we were saying 10 years ago, what were the economic arguments for independence compared to where they are now? And where do you think the argument would be in 5 or 10 years' time? Just effectively, how much has the economy changed? What direction can it go? And how much of a consideration is this when people are thinking about independence?
I think if you're Wales, I think the bigger argument, as I say, I'm not arguing for independence. But if you are arguing for independence, my argument would be that there hasn't been much change. Wales is still very poor. Wales is still very deprived. You've still got huge poverty and there's a huge range of poverty. The reason that there is widespread poverty in the South Wales valleys is very different to why there is huge levels of poverty in the Riverside and Butetown areas of Cardiff. One of them is an issue of deindustrialization and poor infrastructure. The Cardiff example, you can literally see the most profitable and wealthy part of Wales across a river. That isn't an issue of proximity. That's a totally different argument. So I think if you're trying to advocate Welsh independence, I think you need to point out that Wales has become poor within the United Kingdom. Do you look at Wales and say that Westminster has been a good custodian of Wales? I don't think you can. But on the same token, Wales has never been. If you go back, I'm actually not a big fan of going back 600, 700 years and drawing long, elaborate conclusions for what's happening now, because I don't think it's necessarily as useful to the debate we're having, even though it can be emotive. But yeah, I think the argument is: do you see? Does Wales have the tools to fix the problems it has now? I would argue no. Under the current setup of the United Kingdom, the people with those tools, do they seem inclined to solve these problems? I would also argue no. So, yeah, perhaps that I can see why people are landing on the independence argument.
Can I ask you what you think Mark Drakeford's vision of Devo Max would be? Do you know what that is?
Perpetual Welsh Labour rule, I would imagine. Welsh Labour are the most successful political party, democratic political party, potentially in history. If you actually look at, I think they've won every election in Wales, been the largest party for 100 years. That is actually incredible. They've done so much better. It's actually got dark here very quickly. So if I'm disappearing into the night, I apologise. They've done very, as opposed to Scottish Labour, they have managed to, there's a sense of Welshness enshrined within Welsh Labour, which I don't think you actually necessarily got with Scottish Labour and Scottishness. He's essentially left Plaid Cymru with absolutely nowhere to go, because he's essentially taken just below the maximalist position. The only place for Plaid to go is independence. Devo Max, I would, their description of Devo Max depends very much on the audience that they're talking to. He would like essentially for him the biggest thing he wants is a way of remedying disagreements between the UK government and the Welsh government, or different component parts of the UK, and the UK government not being the arbiter of that. I mean, when it's the can't remember the name off the top of my head, but there is a mechanism for the Scottish government and Welsh governments to raise grievances. They raised it when Northern Ireland got its £1 billion bung. Let's call it a bung. It's what it was over Brexit. They lobbied to that, but the UK government are the arbiters in that. But they're not only the people who decide that concern; they're also the ones to decide if there's even a concern to be raised. And they said there's actually no case to hear here. So he would like as much devolved for Wales as reasonably possible. Doesn't want anything. I think he wants actually fairly limited things on taxation. It's mainly around international affairs. But it's essentially as close as you can get to independence before people start going, actually, is this even a single country anymore? I'm going to try and turn the light on as well and see what that does. Okay, might be a bit better.
Yeah, that's better. That's better. Great.
So Welsh politics is again different, or I mean, it's a fair point that you make about London. London again also didn't vote for Brexit. So there are differences, but for people living in Scotland and Wales, we really can't wait for England to sort itself out. It's really time for us to just leave and sort ourselves out and make sure that our countries function, because they're really not functioning within this union at the moment. And I don't really foresee it getting any better now that we have Liz Truss as our Prime Minister.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting, isn't it? Like, because obviously I'm English by birth, and I think I don't think a United Kingdom function in the future unless Englishness is allowed its proper place alongside as a legitimate identity within the British Isles. I think that's actually quite a big issue. I mean, it's actually really interesting. I was looking at quite a lot of it actually done by Cardiff University. And if you look at identity, so if you define yourself as British in Wales, you're much more likely to be Brexit supporting and right of centre. If you define yourself as British in England, you're much more likely to be left of centre and Remain voting. Whereas if you define yourself as English in England, you're essentially British in Wales. Britishness in Wales is a very, very fluid concept, and people are very, very comfortable in large parts of Wales with their Britishness and their Welshness. But if Liz Truss, previously Boris Johnson, decide to make people choose between their Britishness and their Welshness, because Britishness has always been a very loose concept and means different things to different people. If you try and hammer in one size fits all version of Britishness, you're going to be very disappointed if you make people choose, because especially younger people, they're much more comfortable in their idea of being Welsh. I mean, you can see that in the attitude to the language. We could talk for ages about people growing up in the 70s deliberately did not raise their kids bilingually because it was seen as holding them back. Now in Cardiff, I've got friends, English by birth friends, who have moved in order to be in the catchment area for the Welsh language school. Things have changed in a relatively short space of time. So yeah, I think the biggest threat to the union is unionists at this point, to be honest.
Yeah, we're going to quote you on that one, that's for sure. Well, it's been fascinating what you've been saying, and for me, kind of taking a step back and thinking, whether or not I support Welsh independence, what you seem to have said is that currently Wales is in a really bad situation with an education, maybe a general education level that's not the same as the rest of the United Kingdom, a lot of poverty, really deprived areas, and a lot of youngsters in poverty, manufacturing, which is struggling to kind of make a transition, and a real danger that transition will happen similar to what happened with coal, and we're also talking about energy and the investment that's needed in the and tidal energy, and also the infrastructure. And I would say, if I was speaking to anyone from Wales, these aren't problems that you can solve in 10, 15, 20 years' time. These are fundamental problems that you have to start solving now. So really, I think the decision has got to be something that people in Wales will be thinking about making sooner rather than later. You know, this isn't just tweaking around the edges when you're considering independence. It is looking at independence or another way of solving these massive problems. Do you see that sense of urgency? And did the people that you spoke to in Wales see that sense of urgency?
Well, I mean, I suppose the first thing I'd say about education is actually education standards in Wales were higher before devolution, and then they dropped off a cliff after devolution. So they've started to pick up now in certain subjects. It depends whatever you use the P's of measurements or however you measure it. But they are starting to pick up, but they are still below the UK average. But in answer to that question about the immediacy of now, the real conclusion I come to in the book is Wales doesn't have to make a decision about independence, whether it wants to be independence now or not. It needs to have a decision about what sort of country it wants to be. I mean, Wales as a whole has never has only recently got that sense of, maybe a sense of confidence. Like, it's a real paradox of Wales that it's simultaneously the oldest identity on these islands, and it's still trying to figure out what it's going to be when it grows up. It's a real paradox. It's also a paradox in that it's somehow incredibly durable. Like, it's a minor miracle of history that Welsh even the Welsh or Welsh identity even still exists. I mean, until the 1950s, every single document was just England. The Encyclopedia Britannica, up until the 20th century, just said "For Wales, see England." That it's amazing Wales even exists. So I think going forward, the most important thing is that Wales has a conversation with itself about what it wants to be. And just by fact of having this conversation is massive, massive, massive progress, because we just weren't having that. There's always been some people having it, but on a national scale, that conversation about where we want to be, I think, is a huge amount of progress. And that doesn't mean we have to land on independence. It doesn't mean where we have to land. But I think the worst thing that could happen to Wales is to become independent by default. So you have Scotland leave, you have the Good Friday Agreement means that Northern Ireland and Ireland reunify. And then I could easily see a movement in England to say, well, why are we still funding these subsidy junkies across Offa's Dyke? You know, that would be the worst thing that could happen to Wales if it became independent by default, just like buffeted by the decisions made in other countries. For too long, Wales has been that. So it needs to develop a sense of self-confidence. It doesn't have to end up in independence, but I think it needs to at least have the conversation about where it wants to be.
And do you sense that as a matter of urgency, that it has those conversations and ends up where it's going to be?
Well, how can you not have urgency when you've got this many people living in poverty? I mean, you have to have a sense of now, but I think there's also, the fact is, devolution is immensely popular in Wales. After the first very close vote, we then voted massively for further devolution in 2011, and then the last Welsh parliamentary election, anti-devolution parties were completely wiped out. Like they were gone. So devolution is very popular, but it's under pretty sustained attack from the UK government that we're seeing at the moment. So there does need to be a sense of urgency, both because the problems we've got are really big and people are suffering, but also because the gains we have made are actually in danger of being rolled back. So I think there does need to be a sense of urgency there. And I think there is an acknowledgement. I mean, I don't think anybody looks at the current situation, wherever you sit on the political spectrum, and go, God, this is working fantastic. Like, your conclusions for why it's not working could be different, but I don't think anyone's looking at it going, yeah, this is optimum. This is optimum country. This is exactly where we want to be. This is when I look at a polity, I go, yes, I want this absolute back of a fag packet devolved settlement that we've got at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, this levelling up concept that we've got from the Tories coming right at the moment, which is really pork barrel politics, really, when they're just going, hey, I'm the currency issuer, and would you like some money? To various councils around Scotland, one being the one that I'm a councillor in. And we can do this because we can. And of course, the Scottish government can't do that. And it's not very well understood by a lot of people. And we've just had strikes here. I've listened to some of the union leaders talk about the Scottish government as if it has the same powers as the UK government. And it's really not well understood by an awful lot of people just what the differences are. But yes, this levelling up agenda it's completely going past the devolution settlement, and it's no wonder that Mark Drakeford is with the Scottish government on this, because they are the elected representatives.
Yeah, well, quite. I mean, if you want to improve productivity and alleviate poverty in a place, you improve their infrastructure. And Wales has just been the only part of the UK to miss out on any rail funding. So, I mean, that kind of belies the perhaps lack of genuineness behind the levelling up message.
It's absolutely a phrase like trickle down. It's just there for people to reference, but there's no real clear example or explanation of how you level up. And with the current neoliberal economic system that we've got in the UK. A really good point here again from one of our viewers from Ireland. Apart from you're really lucky to have Michael Sheen. We'd give you every MSP from a couple of parties in exchange for Michael Sheen. But apart from that, where else is this narrative coming from? And about Welsh independence, and also, I suppose, tagged onto that, what's been the interest that you've had from this book from other media outlets? So specifically about the work that you're doing, and then more general about what's happening in Wales, I think would answer Rosalind's question.
I mean, a proactive Welsh independence movement that is actively trying to recruit and is shouting very loudly has really only existed for 5-6 years. That's an incredibly short amount of time. Yes Cymru, the main independence movement in Wales, has just appointed a new CEO. They've had some pretty severe growing pains in the last couple of years, and they were the big driver of this conversation. I mean, Michael Sheen does a nice speech on a League of Their Own and stuff. That's all very well, but actually, I don't think people like Michael Sheen and Charlotte Church saying we need independence is actually that helpful for the actual conversation that we need to have. It's good for kind of spotlighting, and it's good for on rugby days, bit of like chest thumping and things. But actually, the whole little Wales, look at us, let's have some. I mean, it's the kind of saying, isn't it, that Scotland wanted levers of power, whereas Wales was happy with symbols of power. We just want to be noticed. There's a reason why Wales is. People in Wales are obsessed with the British and Irish Lions. It's because it's a place where Wales is an equal partner, if not a dominant partner. Like so many British and Irish Lions rugby teams have had a Welsh core that's gone through it, and that's been Wales. I mean, a lot of Welsh nationalism comes down just to wanting an acknowledgement of our own existence. It belies a lack of confidence, and actually, I think we've got to the stage where we need to move past look, little Wales, give us some attention. We need to get to the point where we're actually just having an informed. I mean, that's what teenagers do, isn't it? That's what kids do. Like, give us attention. Look at us. Look, we're real adults. What real adults do is actually do stuff, and that's what we need to get to in the Welsh independence movement. We don't need. I mean, it's great people, doing inspiring speeches and stuff, but let's build the nation that we'd like to see free. Well, independence movement would like to see free. Like. Do that.
From the experience in Scotland, you'll find that's what Scotland wanted to have. But when you're not in control of the media, it's really difficult to start this conversation. And, there was a strongish independent movement in Scotland, which I was part of in the 90s. There was five SNP MPs in the 90s. There was, polling at 20%. It was a big part of the conversation, but it was impossible to have that conversation, and because we'd had the devolution had been from 1970, the vote in 1979, there was a longer period of conversation. But the really important point, I think, Will, is that I'm sure there's people in Wales who want to have that grown-up, sensible conversation, but it's very difficult to have it when they're not getting a platform, because the media is similar, and as it is in Scotland, it's controlled the majority from Westminster. What about the interest in your book? Have you had much engagement from outside? We're really pleased to have you on. It's absolutely wonderful to have you on to discuss this. But do you think there is a growing awareness, even if it's just a small one, that this conversation is happening and is important in Wales?
Yeah, to be honest, I was actually surprised at the interest. So there was The Guardian, Times Radio, BBC, lots of smaller outlets as well. Obviously, I work for Breach PLC, which is seemingly owns everything, in terms of local news, and they've got lots of attention through that. Several, it's been serialized in Western Mail. I think it's I mean, in Wales, there is an issue that there is fewer, as opposed to Scotland, there are fewer Welsh-specific media outlets, but most people in Wales do absorb Welsh-specific media, like they do. And that, I mean, everyone you talk to will have heard now about the debate about an independent Wales. It's now a question to be answered, as opposed to, oh yeah, I've never really thought about that. But what I would say is Wales, again, I can't say it's enough. It is different. Like Wales's border situation. I mean, 50% of people in Wales live within 25 miles of England. It is a very different reality. An independent Wales. That question of integration with England post-independence is something that has to be really, really clearly thrashed out. I mean, Denbighshire, Flintshire, and Wrexham, which are in the northeast of Wales, that is the most commuted out of area of the UK. More people commute out of there. The capital of North Wales, you can make an argument, is Merseyside. So it is a different question, and it's harder to have. But going back to your point, I've been surprised about the attention. Obviously, I'd have loved more media attention on the book. I'd have loved, front pages going, oh my God, this is incredible. But it's, that I got as much attention as I thought it possibly could have done, which I was happy with. But obviously, you always want more.
Yeah, of course.
No,
well, hopefully this SCOTONOMICS will help with that to some extent.
You can certainly see a lot of similarities between the journey that Wales is on and the journey that Scotland's have, and also the similarities. But a lot, as you've pointed out tonight, which I think has been really, really interesting for me, is the differences. The levels of control that you've got. I'm going to put up what someone has said about nationality, because I think this is quite interesting as well. So we'll just see that. The research that was being mentioned suggests English identity is different to Scotland, Wales, or Ireland's, and British and English can live together comfortably within an identity, whereas that's really difficult for the other countries in the UK. So that's interesting. That, again, thanks for sharing that.
I use Richard Winter, the guy he's quoting as part of the book. I know Richard quite well. It's a really, really good piece of research.
Great. A question, we've only got a few minutes left, but I wanted to touch on this idea of energy, because we're in a similar situation in Scotland. We think that this solution is generating cheap energy and selling it abroad. And you cannot base an economy on providing energy for other people to make stuff. You've got to start making stuff and doing stuff with the energy that you're producing. And as you look ahead in a decade or 20 years' time, most of the countries that you'd be trying to sell your energy to have gone through a transition where they've brought in their own cheap energy. And it's something to kind of look at the moment. But really, I kind of wanted to, Wales has got a manufacturing base. It's quite strong. That has to start being turned into making stuff that the rest of the people want with the energy that you're generating. And that takes a long time. And that's why I think it's really important that the conversation moves to, well, how in 10, 15 years do we have a manufacturing base that's similar or getting towards what Ireland has, or, a successful manufacturing industry? Because you're not going to do that under the current settlement over this long period of time. And it is about that transition, and how do you move the economy that, really fascinates me, the situation that you're in.
Yeah, I think Ireland's an interesting one, because Ireland can't follow the Irish model anymore. I mean, they've already acknowledged they have to move away from that party's ending, the low tax, having large multinationals putting money through your country. I think going on the energy thing, it's interesting with Wales, because as part of the book, I sit down with some people much cleverer than me at the Wales Governance Centre, and we go through how you could theoretically even sell electricity. I mean, firstly, we didn't even touch on possibility of EU membership. I think it's actually farcical, the idea of an independent Wales. If we can go into that, let's put that aside for now, because that's probably a different argument. But just think about the practicalities of selling electricity. So there is no Welsh energy grid. Every bit of infrastructure in Wales goes like this. It all goes laterally. If I want to send electricity from my tidal lagoon in Colwyn Bay in the north to Cardiff, I have to send that via England. So my choices are, I either build a new grid, or I have to have an integrated electricity system with Wales. I'm not going to build a new grid, because God, I'm not going to get independence, get monetary levers for the first time, and borrow a whole load of money on international markets to build a grid just the other side of Offa's-Dyke. You're not going to do that. It's similar with selling water. So Wales is a mass exporter, exports loads and loads of water to England. It's a very hot issue because of the flooding of Welsh-speaking communities in order to essentially give Liverpool water. This is a really sensitive topic. But in terms of actually making money from that, to sell it at a way which would have anywhere near the profits you'd need to be making, it's actually cheaper for England just to build stations to desalinate seawater. Also, the water's very expensive to move. It's not like electricity, and all the bits of England that need water are in the southeast. And there's just no way you're going to be able to transport water to there without huge infrastructure investments, and you're then not going to make a lot of money on it. But I agree with you that it is hard to think, right, how do we get to the point that we have a strong manufacturing base which does export things that people need, because we don't have control over all the economic and monetary levers in order to make that happen. I think there's elements of the independence movement they worry about not having a conservative government in London, because they think that's a big recruiting tool for them. And I think in the short term, yes, it is. But I think actually you win the argument over independence when you can prove that it's not who's in Westminster that matters. It's the fact you don't control these arguments, these key tools for solving your problems. It doesn't really matter who is there. So actually, I think, although in a short term, not having a conservative government in Westminster might hurt the independence movement in Wales, I think it actually will move them on to a better debate and a more meaningful argument. So I know I've just gone on a massive tangent for a question you asked, but it's been a long day covering the
I wanted to point out to our audience, who I don't know if they're all aware of this, but Wales is massive for hydro energy as well. Scotland was too. And it has been creating energy for a long time, and could possibly create more. I mean, the main thing for Welsh independence is that if it can be energy sufficient on its own, that would be fantastic. And if it could sell some of its energy on top of that, then even better. That would be great. So I don't think that that's necessarily an argument against Welsh independence.
I don't think it is. I just think it's not an argument for balancing the books in independent Wales. I think it's an inherent good thing to produce your own electricity, but
well, hang on. Countries don't need to balance their books, and this is balance their books,
but they do need to have a much closer fiscal deficit than Wales have. I mean, Wales and Scotland both have a fairly substantial fiscal deficit, but Scotland's, and they're for different reasons. Like,
we don't have deficits because we don't run a currency, and neither does Wales.
Well, I mean, we can go into obviously it's very hard to draw up a budget for a hypothetically independent Wales. But the thing is, it doesn't work. It's a very hard thing to do, because how do you allocate defence spending? Because so much Welsh spending isn't even spent in Wales. It's just allocated on a population basis.
No,
obviously,
these are areas that we'd definitely like to spend a lot more time to go into. But I think our kind of key point, Will, is that it's not a bad thing to have a deficit if you're investing in, for example, rail network and a rail infrastructure, and running up a deficit. And I think my final point on this is a kind of much more kind of macroeconomic thing, but I think this idea of government only having a 3% deficit is something that will never come back. And I think you'll be looking at in a decade's time with an understanding that it's the public sector that has to transition our economy to a net zero economy, and there isn't the profit in it for the private sector, that governments will be running 10 to 20% deficits. And this will be something that's just seen as how we transition. And the arguments that you hear in Wales and in Scotland that we will have too big a fiscal deficit, I think is something we've just got to meet head on and say, well, but every country will have that, but we'll be able to do it in our own currency and we'll be able to control it. So I said, I know this is a much, much bigger part of the conversation, but it's really important, I think, to kind of to highlight that it's a changing world that we'll be inheriting if we do have independent regions.
I agree with you on that, but I think the thing isn't going to change. You're going to need fiscal credibility. I think you can run a deficit if you're credible. And if you've just started a brand new currency, I'm not saying this can't work, but you are going to need fiscal credibility and you're going to need financial prudence in order to do that. If markets see that you're borrowing massive amounts of money to invest in your infrastructure and your education system, that actually could be something that's seen as fiscally prudent. But there has to be a way that you are going to tax and spend. There has to be a way that you're going to do that. You can't just run an indefinite deficit. And that does need a degree of fiscal prudence. I'm not saying that it needs to be 3%, but if you were to take Wales as it is now and say, okay, we're going to float the punt and we're going for independence as we are now, and we're going to borrow more, you're going to borrow at a high rate. That is going to happen. I mean, we could go into this, and it'd be really fun to go into this, but I don't think we've got time.
We have very different views. It would be loads of fun to go into this. Kieran, do you want to finish?
I'd probably get rid of my tea and have a beer, though, I think, if we're going to do that.
Yeah. And we'd love to. Do you want to finish, Kieran?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we're really busy with on this programme, is to make it clear to people that countries don't borrow their own currency. You know, they're the monopoly issuers of their own currency. They're not borrowing it. So what you're talking about when you're talking about borrowing are bonds, and the UK government sells bonds on the open market, and lots of people want to buy them. They think that the Bank of England is a very safe place to put their money. And they're very happy with the 2% and 3% interest that the UK government creates currency to pay. It's not in debt in its own currency. So what matters for a country really is, are you selling enough stuff? Are you making enough stuff to buy stuff from other countries that you need? That's fundamentally what you've really got to be thinking about. And in the case of Wales, which you brought up earlier on, you know, you're always going to be hamstrung when there's no investment in your infrastructure. Your country's not going to function very well if the infrastructure is really poor. And the second thing that's not really helping, and this is something that's just happened in Aberdeen recently, there's a big shopping centre beside me which has gone bankrupt, and they are keeping their money in Guernsey. So what they're doing is they're taking money from the Aberdeen economy, people are paying rents to them, and the money leaves Scotland, it goes to Guernsey, and it never comes back. So the currency is never coming back. It's never flowing. It's never being exchanged for goods and services ever again. So it's for governments with free floating fiat currencies, they have to look at the flow and the accumulations of their currency and what it's doing. And if it's flowing across into other countries and just sitting in bank accounts doing nothing, then it's not performing its function, which is to make the country function and exchange goods and services between the people in that country on a domestic level. And that then if you're doing that efficiently and you have an advanced economy, you have people who are highly educated and are making things that other countries want to buy, then that's ideal. That's what you want as an advanced economy. But you want that in general. You know, that's you want to be able to buy things from other people, and they want to buy things from you. That's the situation you want to be in. And you know, countries have their own different types of resources dependent on their geography, their education, where they are, and you know, it's making yourself attractive from that perspective. That's important. The currency is just a tool.
Yeah. Do you want me to come on to Rosa?
Yeah, please. I think that's how I'd like. To finish.
Can I just clarify? Yeah. It's Roisin.
my apologies. I mean, I'm an English guy with an anglicised tongue trying to live in Wales. I'm used to mispronouncing it, I can promise you. Wouldn't independent Wales join the EU? Okay, so it's a big park, but let's park the fact that Wales voted to leave. Let's put that aside at this point. I almost didn't even bother approaching this question in the book, because ultimately it is for an independent Wales to decide whether it joins the EU. The reason that I did tackle it in the end is because of the sheer volume of people who are supporting Welsh independence as a vehicle for getting their EU membership back. I think let's just take the border situation really, really briefly, because Wales has a completely integrated border. As part of the research for this, I drove the link for that border several times, and I stopped at every place along that border. There are pubs where the border goes through the middle of the bar. The first time Wales ever broke from England in any kind of legislation was dry Sundays in the late 1800s, when you couldn't drink on a Sunday, and people used to buy a pint on the English side of the bar and go to the toilet on the Welsh side. That's how they got around it. It is incredibly integrated. It's just like Wrexham, Chester Football Club. Actually, their ground is in Wales, but you can only get to it through England. It's a completely different notion. You couldn't feasibly have Wales in the EU if the current situation with the United Kingdom, with the remaining United Kingdom, was as it is now. I actually privately don't think that will be the case in 20, 30 years' time. So let's put that aside. Let's just look at timeframes. So if your argument for an independent Wales is that you want to join the EU, let's say Plaid Cymru has to win two Senedd elections. They've indicated that if they won one, there would be an indicative referendum. The next time there would be a full referendum. So say 10 years down the line, say that Plaid then wins a referendum. So we're 10 years down the line. Wales votes to leave the UK. Let's say 5 years negotiation. There's a strong argument that it should be far, far, far longer than that. So you're still 15 years down the line. The idea that an independent Wales, the first thing it's going to do is hold a referendum on EU membership I'm pretty skeptical about that. So say we be really generous and we say it's another 5 years between when Wales then votes to start EU membership. You then start, so we're 20 years down the line. You then have the negotiations. By then you've been out of the EU for almost 25 years. So you probably don't have as much alignment. Let's be really generous and say those negotiations take 5 years. You're now 25 years down the line. I mean, this is like an obscenely generous time frame. 25 years ago, the EU in its current form barely existed. So you are using independence as a vehicle for getting to an organization which might not even exist at this point. And the idea that you want to get your sovereignty from Westminster because you're annoyed that Wales has been cut down from 40 to 30 MPs, to then give a lot of that newfound sovereignty to an EU body where you're going to have at best 5 MEPs is, I think, a bit of a farce. I don't think that makes sense. You've also got the whole, if you join the EU, you're going to have limitations on how you can devalue your currency, because you might not have to join the euro, but you're not going to be able to. You're going to have some likely be pegged to the euro. That's what they have in Denmark, for instance. So, I think it's. I think it could join the EU, or whatever the EU happens to be at that point. But also, the EU's got its own problems at the moment. Poland, Hungary. It's not the beacon of hope. And I also think, God, if you're upset that Wales is, been supported by England and you want it to stand on its own 2 feet, to go in and rely on subsidy and structural funds again, I just think is a bit of a backward step. But that's just my view. But I think you're barking up the wrong tree if you see independence as the easiest way back to EU membership.
That's fascinating. One comment I would make there is I agree with everything you've said. However, I again, I'm coming back to this kind of immediacy, and I think looking back at the last 25 years and thinking that that's the ability and that's the speed that we're going to have to move to tackle this absolutely monumental climate and diversity crisis is the wrong perspective. And I think things that took 5 years, in 5 years' time, are going to take a year. So I think that the time frame for a lot of changes that we have to make, and if you're in Wales thinking we do not have the funding to build defence walls, to change our infrastructure, we've got to get into the European Union in 18 months to be able to do this. I personally think we're completely underestimating the impact that these crises are going to have on our politics and how fast we have to move. So I know that's a very different perspective of the same situation. But
Cardiff's one of the most exposed capitals. Cardiff's one of the most exposed capitals to climate change in the world, because it's essentially below sea level, and it's at the bottom of like 8 very floodable valleys which are full of mine shafts. It's in a really, really vulnerable position. It's been like, I think it was that and Ho Chi Minh City are considered 2 of the most vulnerable in the world. So and that includes Amsterdam. So yeah, it's there's going to be an immediacy, which I wish people had felt 20 years ago, to be honest, about climate change.
Yeah, I wish they'd felt it in the 1970s when, after the Club of Rome published. That would have been better.
Yeah, that would have been great. But the second best time is right now, isn't it? So
yeah, absolutely. Well, it's been fantastic, and I'm glad to see you went for water and not beer when you'd finished your tea. So we've had you for over an hour. We've had you for over an hour. Honestly, we really, really appreciate you coming on. It's been fascinating to hear your thoughts and how you distilled the research from the book. Please do buy it if you're interested in seeing the similarities between Wales and Scotland, and also I'm sure it's a really interesting read. I actually live in Catalonia, Wales, so I'm kind of fascinated by the other independence movements, and I wanted to speak to you a lot more about the language and culturally the impact it has on independence, because that's not really what the driver is in Scotland, and it is here, and I think it is a lot in Wales. So I'm sure there's much more we could have spoken to you about, but we'll let you go. And again, thanks very much for joining us.
Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you.
Thanks, mate. Bye now. Well, that really was fascinating. It's amazing to see how many people have stayed with us over that hour. So thanks for all the questions. Kieran, anything you want to finish before we let all our audience go as well?
Yeah, no, I find the whole thing really interesting, you know, and it's a very interesting language, Welsh. I mean, I visited very many times. Builth Wales was the place that I used to visit very often, but I've been to North Wales, and the language is very, very interesting. It's very different from other languages. But that's an interesting point that Will makes about Cardiff being so vulnerable to climate change. I had no idea. I didn't know that. That's very interesting.
Yeah, and certainly it is really interesting. But if you look across the globe, the impact that the climate, the global warming is having, or global overheating, as I think it's better to call it, global overheating is having, it's impacting every single country. If it's the melting of the ice caps, if it's the raising of the sea levels, if it's a lack of biodiversity, if it's the land that's been changing, there's all these issues are going to impact everyone in Europe round about the same time, and that's the lens I think we have to be looking at. But I thought it was really interesting to look at that lens of Wales through this idea of currency as well, and still that understanding that we're too small because we have to borrow all this money at a really high rate, when we know that it's the central bank that sets the rate for the money that it wants to release into the economy. So these are really important points of consistency, again, across the people that we speak to. Really appreciate you joining us tonight. Next week, we've got a really interesting conversation around blue, I think they call it, is it blue oil? We call water, and we're with as Scotland's biggest resource. We're going to cover a lot about what that actually means, how that can work in your economy, and what's happening in other parts of the world, and what's already happening with water. Is it going down this real kind of commodity financial structure that we have in other resources? So a really fascinating conversation, which really ties us back in to Scotland and the Scottish economy. So hope you can join us for that.
But William, we have a guest before that, and we're going to talk about scarcity on Friday with him. So I think that's the one we're doing first, and then we're doing the water afterwards. Yeah,
we've got so much. We've got so much going on. Okay, well, it's good to know that, Kieran, because I wasn't aware of that was our Friday show. I've been really busy. I've just finished my masters, so hopefully that's a little.
So that's the Friday evening we're interviewing.
So. Okay, fantastic. That's just for us, though. We'll be live, with a recorded show on Monday. Thanks, everyone, for joining us, and hope you enjoy the rest of your evening and the rest of your weekend. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.